In the quiet of an ordinary evening, a secret lay hidden, one that would send a chill through every soul who heard it. When a long-buried truth resurfaced, no one knew the terrifying turn it would take. A lost face, a vengeful heart, and a story forgotten by time, now re-emerged, ready to change everything. Tonight, as we dive into this old tale, a man's pain, a journey for answers, and a truth once buried, will come to light, forever altering everything in its wake. It was a crisp, early spring morning in St. Mary, the kind of day that coaxed daffodils to rise with shy enthusiasm, and made the village hum quietly with the work of the day. In her small but well-tended cottage garden, Miss Jane Marple was bent over a stubborn rose bush, her gloved hands delicately adjusting a climbing stem, as though she were lacing a corset. To the casual observer, she might have seemed like just another elderly lady in a quiet village, but those who knew her, few as they were, understood that behind her soft voice and gentle manner, there resided a mind as sharp as it was relentless. The air was alive with the song of birds, and in the distance, the chime of the church bell reminded her that it was 10:30. She straightened up, brushing the soil from her cardigan, and glanced towards the hedge at the back of her garden. A robin flitted by, and a cat stretched lazily on the stone wall. Everything appeared just as it should be. Yet, even in such peaceful moments, Miss Marple never ceased observing. And that morning, as it would turn out, was the beginning of a most peculiar chain of events. It was perhaps 10 minutes later, when she noticed him, a man tall, possibly in his 50s, standing near the far hedge, partially hidden by the hawthorn branches. He wore a grey overcoat, neatly buttoned despite the warmth, and a dark hat that shadowed most of his face. At first, Miss Marple thought he might be lost, or perhaps admiring the tulips, but there was something unsettling in his stillness. He wasn't gazing at the flowers, he was staring at the house, more specifically, at the window of her sitting room. Miss Marple blinked, then called out, "Can I help you?" The man did not answer. She began walking slowly toward him, her voice calm but firm. "You must have come through the side gate. It's usually closed." But before she could reach the midpoint of the lawn, the man turned, almost too smoothly, and disappeared behind the hedge. By the time she reached the boundary, he was gone. No footsteps on the gravel path, no creak of the gate, as though he had never been there at all. Miss Marple stood still, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes narrowing. "Curious," she murmured. "Very curious." It wasn't until later that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Just after tea, Reverend Phelps arrived, looking more flustered than usual. His spectacles were slightly askew, and his voice trembled as he stood awkwardly in Miss Marple's drawing room, clutching his hat to his chest. "Miss Marple, I thought I should tell you myself. There's been a discovery behind the church, in the far corner near the yew tree." He paused. "A body, a man. I'm afraid he's dead." Miss Marple's fingers froze mid-stitch, her gaze never leaving her embroidery. "Did anyone recognize him?" she asked softly. Reverend Phelps shook his head. "No one from the village. But Miss Marple, he was described as tall, grey coat, dark hat." She folded her embroidery carefully, setting it aside. "Then I imagine," she said quietly, her voice firm, "that I have seen him too. Only this morning in my garden." That evening, the police arrived, and Sergeant Drew, though polite, was clearly wary in Miss Marple's presence. He asked the usual questions. Had she spoken to the man? Had he left anything behind? "No," Miss Marple replied, but he stared quite intently. It was unsettling. The man's belongings revealed little. A pocket watch, a ticket from Paddington to Much Benham, a wallet devoid of money, no identification, and curiously, no initials or monogram. But it was the final item that caused Sergeant Drew's brow to furrow. From inside the man's coat, tucked into a stitched fold near the lining, they retrieved an old photograph. Sergeant Drew passed it silently to Miss Marple. The photograph, sepia-toned and frayed at the edges, showed a young woman in a summer garden, a faint smile on her face, holding a parasol. The resemblance was unmistakable. Miss Marple's lips parted, but she said nothing for a moment. The connection was clear. And now, more than ever, she knew that the mystery was far from over. It was a brisk, almost chill morning in the small village of St. Mary, where the sun, though rising, seemed hesitant, casting a soft golden glow over everything it touched, including Miss Jane Marple's little garden, neatly enclosed by a white picket fence. Her fingers, despite the coolness, moved nimbly among the rose bushes as she worked, tying up wayward branches that seemed determined to escape their place. Her mind, however, was far from the mundane task at hand. The stillness of the morning, the quiet whispers of the village, and the strange glimmer of something hidden in the air tugged at her thoughts. Miss Marple wasn't just any ordinary village woman. She was a woman who saw far more than what appeared on the surface. It wasn't long before she noticed him. A man, standing near the corner of her garden, partially obscured by the thick hedge that bordered the property. Tall, his overcoat buttoned tightly against the morning chill, and a dark hat pulled low over his brow. He stood there, unmoving, not admiring the flowers as most would do, but staring at her house with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Miss Marple, with her usual calmness, called out to him, asking if he needed help, but he didn't respond. His gaze lingered a moment longer before he turned and disappeared behind the hedge, as quietly as he had arrived. It wasn't until later in the day that the pieces began to align. The village, known for its peaceful rhythm, was suddenly disturbed by a discovery. A body had been found behind the church, near the ancient yew tree, a place that had witnessed more than its fair share of village gossip and quiet prayer. Miss Marple, as always, remained observant, while the rest of St. Mary's whispered with curiosity and conjecture. The dead man, it turned out, was no stranger to suspicion. His overcoat, his low hat, the eerie stillness in which he had stood, all these things were now more significant than ever. As the evening wore on, the village gathered in silence at the news, but Miss Marple, still deep in thought, sat alone in her parlor, a photograph in her hand. The photograph, aged and crinkled, showed a younger version of herself, unaware, unguarded, at a summer house party decades ago. The face staring back at her was now nothing more than a memory, yet there was something deeply unsettling about the presence of that picture in the man's possession. Why would he have carried it? Why hidden so carefully? And what had brought him to her garden? After so many years, the evening passed quietly as Miss Marple pondered these questions. Inspector Crail, a tall man with a perpetually stern expression, arrived soon after. The moment he settled into her sitting room, there was an unspoken tension between them, as though the very air was thick with the weight of things unsaid. He asked about the man she had seen earlier that day, and Miss Marple's reply was measured, serene. "Yes," she said, stirring her tea slowly. "He stood in my garden for a brief moment, but when I called out to him he disappeared." Crail's gaze flickered to the photograph, resting on the table between them. "And you're certain this is you in the photograph?" he asked. "Quite certain," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "It was taken years ago in Suffolk when I was no more than a girl." The inspector nodded thoughtfully. Yet he carried it, folded carefully in his coat. "What do you make of that?" Miss Marple paused, her eyes never leaving the photograph. "I can't say," she said quietly, "but one imagines it meant more to him than it ever did to me." Crail's eyes narrowed, suspicion clouding his thoughts, but Miss Marple had already turned her attention to something else, something more important. Her mind was already moving beyond the obvious, beyond what the others would see, to the spaces between the words, to the silences that held secrets. She knew better than anyone. Nothing in St. Mary's was ever truly as simple as it seemed. And this man, this body, this forgotten photograph, they were pieces of a much larger puzzle, one that was slowly revealing its darker edges. The morning after Inspector Crail's visit, Miss Marple rose early, the soft light of dawn spilling through her curtains, casting a quiet glow over the village. Her shoes, practical and worn with time, clicked gently against the cobblestones as she set out, her thoughts already far ahead of her steps. She had told no one of her plans, not even her ever-curious maid, Cherry. It wasn't secrecy, per se, but Miss Marple knew that the mind worked best in solitude, away from distractions, especially when piecing together a mystery. Only once she had enough fragments of information would she share them, for she preferred to let the pieces fall into place in their own time. She didn't rush, never hurried, but moved with a calm certainty, knowing how often the smallest observations went unnoticed by others. Her destination was the village station, and it was here she encountered Bertie, a young ticket clerk with wide eyes, eager to please. The conversation began casually enough, but Miss Marple, with her gentle, unassuming manner, soon coaxed from him a rather useful piece of information. Bertie remembered a man who had passed through just 2 days prior, a middle-aged gentleman in a clean coat, formal in appearance, who had purchased a return ticket from Paddington but never returned. The man had asked for directions to the vicarage, and had inquired whether the churchyard was still open to the public. Miss Marple's mind whirred, as she processed this new tidbit. A visitor to the vicarage, asking about the churchyard. Curious indeed. And the cane? She asked, her voice casual but intent. A silver-topped cane, Bertie confirmed, noticing the distinctiveness of the gentleman's walking stick. Miss Marple felt the first stirrings of clarity. This man, she was certain, had come with a purpose, purposeful visits. Miss Marple knew from years of quiet observation, were rarely innocent. He had come to St. Mary Me for a reason, and that reason was beginning to take shape in Miss Marple's mind, though she was careful not to reveal it. Her next stop was the cottage beside the vicarage, where Miss Diana Stone, an artist known for her reclusive nature, had settled in the spring. Miss Stone was a woman who kept mostly to herself, often found painting late into the night. When Miss Marple arrived, she was greeted by Diana with a polite but distant demeanor, her hands stained with the colors of her craft. The cottage was filled with the unmistakable scent of oil paints and turpentine, the walls crowded with landscapes, still lifes and portraits. Yet it was the painting tucked behind an easel that caught Miss Marple's attention. She moved closer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the unfinished portrait. There, clearly depicted on the canvas, was a man, grey coat, strong brow, and beside him, resting against the chair, a silver-topped cane. The likeness to the man Miss Marple had seen in her garden was undeniable. The air between them grew taut, and Miss Marple could feel Diana's unease, though the woman quickly masked it. "It's just a study," Diana insisted, her voice a touch too hurried. "I paint faces from memory sometimes." Miss Marple, always one to speak little and observe much, nodded with a serene smile. "Indeed, memories often come uninvited, don't they? Especially those we would rather forget." Diana's eyes flickered briefly, the faintest blush creeping up her neck, betraying her. Miss Marple, however, did not press further. She knew from experience that some things were better left unspoken, their meaning carried in the silence between words. The tension was palpable, and Miss Marple filed this encounter away, her mind already calculating its place in the puzzle. The truth, as always, would be found not in the words people spoke, but in the things they left unsaid. Leaving Diana Stone's cottage, Miss Marple headed toward the churchyard. Here, she encountered Major Harold Finch, his face red with indignation as he muttered darkly about the disgrace of a dead man being found in such a tranquil place. "A dead man in the churchyard. What is the world coming to?" he grumbled, his voice carrying across the small crowd gathered near the vicarage. Miss Marple, ever composed, gave him a gentle smile. "I dare say death has always paid its respects here, Major, though usually in a more scheduled fashion." The Major's face softened for a moment, a gruff chuckle escaping his lips, but his posture remained stiff, and his eyes narrowed as Miss Marple continued, her words cutting through the air with unexpected precision. "Rather near the vicarage, though, don't you think?" The Major's expression hardened, and Miss Marple could see the muscles in his jaw tighten, his gaze flickering toward the churchyard with newfound wariness. He did not respond, but the tension that hung in the air was unmistakable. With each encounter, Miss Marple was slowly, carefully, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. The man with the silver-topped cane, his appearance in her garden, and the connections she had uncovered. The oddity of a man asking about the churchyard, the mysterious artist with her unfinished portrait, and now the disgruntled Major Finch. whose behavior was less about concern for the dead, and more about his own sense of propriety being disturbed. All these threads, though still loosely woven together, pointed toward a single, unsettling truth. Something far more sinister than a simple accident had taken place in the quiet village of St. Mary Me. The answers were there, hidden in plain sight, buried in the silences of the villagers, the forgotten memories, and the weight of the unspoken. And Miss Marple, with her sharp eye and even sharper mind, was more than ready to unearth them, piece by piece, until the full story emerged in its chilling entirety. The morning light, pale and soft, spilled through the curtains, casting long shadows across Miss Marple's small parlor. The stillness of the room mirrored the peace of St. Mary Me, a village that, to the untrained eye, seemed untouched by time and trouble. Yet, Miss Marple knew better. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding, a hum that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface of her quiet surroundings. The events of the previous day, the discovery of the body near the Finch family plot, had set something in motion, and she could feel it now, like a faint tremor, slowly growing stronger with each passing hour. The body had not been found just anywhere. It had been discovered only feet away from the Finch family's gravestone, a place Major Harold Finch held so dear. His immediate defensive reaction when Miss Marple had casually mentioned the proximity had not gone unnoticed. There was more to the Major's reaction than mere surprise or curiosity. There was something deeper, something he was reluctant to confront. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of letting the matter rest. His response had only confirmed her suspicions. There was something more to this story, something hidden behind his stiff facade. She had noticed it in the way he'd bristled, his brow furrowing slightly as he stiffened at her suggestion. "You must be quite familiar with that part of the grounds," she had said. A casual inquiry. "Yes, the west corner," he had replied, his tone sharp. "Been Finchland since 1791. My great-uncle George is buried there." His voice had held the weight of history, yet his words did not reassure her. It was his next reaction that made her heart race. "Are you suggesting I was involved?" he had demanded, his voice tight. "Not at all, Major." Miss Marple had smiled, her expression unreadable. "Merely that you might have seen something. People often do without realizing its importance." His response had been a vague sound of disapproval, accompanied by a muttered remark about idle gossip. Then he had stalked away, his brisk pace and sharp movements betraying a nervousness he couldn't entirely conceal. Miss Marple's gaze had followed him as he retreated, her mind whirring with the implications of his actions. Beneath the bravado, Major Finch had been rattled, unsettled, as though the body had not merely arrived at the graveyard, but had somehow returned, summoned from the past, its presence a reminder of something long buried. Later that day, as the village settled into its familiar rhythm, Miss Marple had made her way to the parish kitchen, where Polly Griggs, the vicar's young servant, had been busy polishing the brass candlesticks. It was here, in a half-whisper, half-confession, that Polly had revealed something that until that moment, Miss Marple had not considered. "You ought to know something, miss," Polly had said, her eyes darting nervously around the room, as if she feared being overheard. "It was the night before the police came. I saw someone." Her voice had trembled, and Miss Marple had paused, watching the girl intently. "Go on, dear," she had urged, her tone soft yet encouraging. "I couldn't sleep," Polly continued, her words spilling out in a rush. "The wind was tapping at the shutters, and I came down for milk. That's when I saw it. The light in the study. I thought the vicar had left the lamp on, but then I saw a shadow, someone moving in the study." The image of the shadow, tall and indistinct, standing near the desk, had unsettled Miss Marple. Polly had nodded, her hands shaking slightly. "I didn't see his face, miss. Just the shape. A coat, I think. Then I heard the floorboard creak, and he was gone, just like that." Miss Marple had asked, her curiosity piqued. "Did you tell the vicar?" "Oh no, miss," Polly had whispered, her voice barely audible. "At first I thought it might have been him, but when the body was found the next day, I knew it weren't right." Miss Marple had gently touched the girl's hand, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "You were very wise to tell me," Miss Marple had said, In Polly's timid confession, Miss Marple had heard something vital. The dead man had not come merely to observe, but to search, and he had done so in the dark of night. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more convinced she became that this was no ordinary crime. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, albeit slowly, with each discovery. She had read the inspector's report again, that afternoon, noting the peculiar details that others might have missed. The man's boots, for instance, had been caked with dark soil, soil that did not belong to the graveyard. It was deeper, richer, and the scuffing on the heels was unusual. Nothing else had struck the inspector as odd, but Miss Marple knew better. She spent hours tending to her garden, and she knew the soil of St. Mary Me like the back of her hand. The soil in the graveyard was pale and sandy, not at all like the dark, almost clay-like mud she had seen on the dead man's boots. There was only one place in the village where such soil remained damp even in the spring: the private greenhouse path on the Finch estate. She made a mental note of it, a thread of connection she would return to later. But it wasn't just the soil that bothered her, it was the photograph. A faded image from a garden party in 1904, taken at her cousin Lydia's home. The man in the photo had carried it folded in his pocket, preserved despite the years. Something gnawed at Miss Marple, a sensation just beyond her grasp. She opened an old album, turning the pages until she found the familiar picture. But this time, her gaze was drawn not to the face, blurred and distant, but to the posture of the man. He stood in the background, seemingly unimportant, yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that she knew him. Had this stranger been part of her life long ago? Had he watched her, perhaps even known her? And if so, why had he returned now, after all these years? Her mind raced as she pieced together the fragments: the photograph, the shadow in the study, the soil on his boots, and realized that this was no coincidence. There was a reason, a motive, behind his return. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her knitting abandoned, her thoughts drifting back to another time. She recalled the whispers at dances, the subtle glances exchanged behind paper fans, the names of vanished friends that no one dared to speak aloud. One name stood out: Lavinia Blackthorne, a bright young girl, full of promise, whose sudden disappearance had never been explained. The memory of Lavinia's vanishing, long forgotten by most, now resurfaced in Miss Marple's mind, and she felt a chilling certainty that the past and the present were connected in a way she had not yet fully understood. With a deep sigh, Miss Marple knew that she was getting closer to the truth. The pieces were finally falling into place, and she would not rest until she uncovered the whole story, no matter how long it took, or how deep the shadows ran. The village of St. Mary Me held secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to unearth every last one of them. The delicate light of early morning filtered through the lace curtains, casting long shadows across Miss Marple's quaint parlor, where the peace of St. Mary Me seemed almost too serene. But within her, a quiet unrest brewed, for the village that appeared untouched by scandal and strife hid secrets deep beneath its calm exterior. The discovery of the body near the Finch family plot was no accident, she knew. There were things that didn't add up, things hidden in plain sight, and the cold hush of the graveyard whispered to her. The body's placement, only yards away from Major Harold Finch's beloved family tomb, had struck Miss Marple as strange, and even more telling had been the Major's reaction when she'd casually mentioned it to him. His usual politeness had faltered for the briefest moment, and in that moment, Miss Marple had sensed something vital. A defensiveness in his voice, a tightness around his jaw, as if she'd uncovered something he had hoped would remain buried. "You're familiar with that part of the grounds, aren't you, Major?" she had asked, her tone deceptively light. "Yes, the west corner," he had replied curtly, his eyes narrowing. "Been Finchland since 1791. My great-uncle George is buried there." His words, laced with history, did not reassure her. If anything, they deepened the mystery. But it was his next words, an almost imperceptible shift in his demeanor, that piqued her suspicion. "Are you suggesting I was involved?" The question had come out sharp, more defensive than inquisitive. Miss Marple, unfazed, had smiled gently. Not at all, Major. Merely suggesting that you may have seen something. People often do without realizing its significance. He had mumbled something about idle gossip and stalked off, his movements betraying a tightness that didn't escape Miss Marple's keen eye. Later that same day, in the quiet of the vicarage, Polly Griggs, young, nervous, and often overlooked, had approached Miss Marple. There had been a faint tremor in her voice as she spoke, a fear that Miss Marple could not ignore. "I wasn't going to say anything, miss," Polly had confessed, "but I saw them, Major Finch and the man who died. I was fetching kindling for the vicar, just by the hedge near the Finch property. It was near dusk. They were arguing. The Major was shouting, red-faced. The other man kept his voice low, like he was trying to calm him. But then the Major pushed him hard, and stormed off. The man just stood there a moment, then walked away. He looked tired, sad even." The words had fallen from Polly's lips like a carefully hidden truth. Miss Marple, with practiced ease, had placed a gloved hand on the girl's arm. "You did well to tell me, Polly," she had said, her voice soft but laden with unspoken understanding. The timing of Polly's confession had been too perfect to ignore, and Miss Marple had carefully shared it with Inspector Cray, who had raised an eyebrow and noted it down with evident curiosity. Major Finch claimed he was in Bath that evening, with an old regiment friend, the inspector had remarked. Miss Marple, of course, had kept her thoughts to herself, but in the recesses of her mind, a small crack had formed in the Major's carefully constructed alibi. 2 days later, a constable from Much Benham arrived at her door, bringing more news, an unexpected discovery hidden within the deceased's walking stick. A hidden compartment, cleverly concealed beneath the silver top, held a photograph. It was newer than the one Miss Marple had seen earlier, a photo of a young girl, no older than 16. Her expression was grave, her dark eyes fixed on something unseen, beyond the reach of the camera lens. Miss Marple showed it to Polly, but the girl recoiled, her face pale. "I've never seen her before," Polly had said with certainty. But Miss Marple noticed her discomfort, the way her eyes darted, as if something about the photo unsettled her. "You're quite sure?" Miss Marple had asked gently. "Yes," Polly had replied. "She looks like one of those girls from the war, maybe. From a training camp." The image lingered in Miss Marple's mind, its presence like a puzzle piece just out of reach. The face was hauntingly familiar, but she couldn't place it. She showed the photograph to Diana Stone the following day, the artist's reaction telling her more than words ever could. Diana studied the photo for longer than expected, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed it back. "I don't know her," Diana had said, her voice steady, but Miss Marple noticed the slight hitch in her breath. Later, as Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting untouched, she pondered the photograph's meaning. If the first picture had been a remnant of a lost love, this one seemed to speak of something far darker, something carried not for nostalgia, but perhaps for guilt, or for protection, a secret that weighed heavily on its keeper. On a crisp afternoon, with the faint scent of smoke from distant woodfires in the air, Miss Marple wandered past the Finch estate, her steps slow and deliberate. The garden, now overgrown, whispered with memories of days long past. As her mind churned over the new evidence, the name Lavinia Blackthorne floated to the surface of her thoughts, like a ghost from another time. Lavinia, a bright young woman once engaged to a man her family had disapproved of, had vanished years ago, her name all but erased from polite conversation. Rumors swirled of a secret departure, a life cut short by scandal or shame, and a suitor who had disappeared as well. Could it be? Could the man who had once been a part of her life now be standing in her garden, just as forgotten memories were beginning to resurface? Daniel Carradine. The name echoed through Miss Marple's mind like an old half-forgotten song. If it was him, then the photograph was no mere clue. It was a memory, a keepsake that had survived the years, perhaps the only thing he had left to remind him of a time long gone. With that thought, Miss Marple set down her teacup, her resolve firm. The past, as she knew all too well, was never truly buried, especially not in a village like St. Mary Me. Every glance, every whispered word, every quiet corner of the village, held a truth waiting to be unearthed. It was time to dig deeper, to go back further than anyone else dared. There was a secret here, one long thought forgotten, but Miss Marple would uncover it, no matter how painful, how dangerous. It was only a matter of time before the past caught up with the present. Miss Marple, with her usual quiet grace, had long understood that in the small tightly knit village of St. Mary Me, the past never truly rested. Secrets, whether buried in the garden soil, or whispered over a cup of tea, had a tendency to surface when least expected. On an unusually brisk afternoon, she found herself passing Diana Stone's cottage, her steps slower as she neared the familiar white gate. Today, however, there was something different, a thick, acrid plume of smoke rising from the chimney, more dense than the ordinary scent of wood burning. It wasn't the usual fragrance of pine wood. This was far more pungent, like burning paper or something far less benign. Miss Marple paused, narrowing her eyes as she scanned the surrounding area. A fire, on such a crisp spring day, should have felt comforting, but this one had a weight to it, a sense of foreboding that pricked at her instincts. She knocked on the door, her knock polite, measured, but there was no answer, only the sound of crackling flames from within. A quiet tension lingered in the air. With a quick glance over her shoulder, Miss Marple turned on her heel, her expression inscrutable. There was something about the scene that gnawed at her, a deep sense that the smoke wasn't the only thing that needed to be uncovered. That evening, under the guise of delivering lemon preserves for the vicar's tea, Miss Marple passed the cottage again. This time, the gate was left unlocked, an unexpected detail. She had learned long ago to never dismiss the smallest signs. As she walked by, something caught her eye near the stone path. There, nestled beside the overgrown hedge, was a faint pile of ashes, remnants from the hearth. Miss Marple crouched down carefully, her fingers brushing the charred remains, searching for anything that might tell her more. It was then that she saw it, an envelope, scorched at the edges, but still partially intact. She retrieved it with a handkerchief, careful not to damage it further. The postmark was faint but readable. London, 1943. The address was partially burned away, but the name St. Mary Me remained visible, adding a layer of mystery to the already peculiar find. Miss Marple tucked the scrap of paper into her gardening apron, pondering its significance. She thought of the photograph, the second one that had sent a shiver down Diana's spine. The girl in the uniform. Who was she? And why had Diana reacted so oddly? There was something in the way Diana had trembled when she saw it, something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. The next day, the telegram arrived. The body had been identified. Daniel Carradine. His name sent a ripple through Miss Marple's calm demeanor. He was no stranger to the village. In fact, the name had been muttered in the shadows of wartime rumors, whispers of a man who had vanished before his trial for aiding the enemy. But no one had known exactly where he had gone, and certainly, no one had expected him to return. Yet, there he was, dead and tied to a place that seemed to hold no connection to him. St. Mary Me. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly, her thoughts swirling. Inspector Cray, who had always approached matters with careful precision, seemed less sure of himself now. He explained how Carradine's sudden reappearance in St. Mary Me was odd to say the least. He had no family here, no recorded history, so what had drawn him back? Miss Marple's mind raced, tracing the shadows of Carradine's past. She knew well enough that in villages like St. Mary Me, old stories had a tendency to come back to life in the most unexpected ways. She said little, but the questions churned inside her. Was Carradine truly guilty, or had he been the scapegoat for something far darker? The whispers grew louder throughout the village. Mrs. Bantry, always the dramatist, spun a wild tale of Carradine's return to expose a wartime conspiracy, only to be silenced. The gossip spread like wildfire, each new theory more implausible than the last. Major Finch, who had been overhearing these discussions, had reacted with surprising aggression, nearly knocking over a card table in his haste to dismiss the talk. His face turned red as he argued that the war was over, that old bones should stay buried. But Miss Marple, ever observant, had noticed the slight shift in his demeanor. When the conversation turned to Lavinia Blackthorne, the woman who had once disappeared under mysterious circumstances, Finch had excused himself quickly, and Miss Marple had felt a spark of realization. The war might be over, but some things were far from settled. In a village like this, where every glance could carry 1,000 unspoken words, she knew that the past was never truly gone. It lingered, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The following days only intensified the air of secrecy. Every corner of St. Mary Me seemed to hold a clue, every word a potential unraveling of the truth. The village buzzed with speculation, each person adding their own piece to the puzzle. But Miss Marple knew that the truth, like smoke, would not be so easily contained. It would find its way out, slipping through the cracks, just as it always did. She continued to watch, listen, and wait, knowing that the pieces would eventually fall into place. But how much longer would it take before the real story of Daniel Carradine and Lavinia Blackthorne was finally told? Miss Marple had always understood that in the quiet, unassuming corners of St. Mary Me, truth had a peculiar way of hiding in plain sight, just out of reach, veiled by the whispers of well-meaning villagers and the casual turn of a blind eye. Yet, in the case of Daniel Carradine's return, there was an unease in the air, an odd discomfort that made the normally comforting landscape feel, for the first time in many years, menacing. It wasn't the simple return of a man thought lost to the shadows of time. No, it was the way he had come back, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, slipping through the cracks of every assumption made about him. Sitting across from Reverend Phelps at tea, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to settle like dust, before speaking the words that had been coiling in her mind. "I do wonder," she began, her voice low, deliberate, "whether we have been looking in the wrong direction entirely." The vicar raised an eyebrow, his fingers pausing in the act of spreading butter on his scone. "You mean Carradine?" he asked, his tone mild but edged with curiosity. She nodded, then continued, "Not him. Precisely. But the talk of spies, of wartime treachery, it feels so convenient, don't you think? Everyone suddenly an expert on espionage, as though it's all so simple, so clear-cut. But you and I both know, Reverend, that true danger rarely arrives in such grand, obvious forms." The vicar studied her quietly, his brow furrowing in thought. "You suspect something more domestic?" Miss Marple didn't flinch, only gave a slight nod, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her cup. "More intimate," she said, her words soft but filled with an undeniable gravity. "Betrayal," she continued, "does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a kind smile, a respectable hat, a familiar scent." She paused, her gaze flicking briefly to the vicar, who was now looking at her with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "Do you think Carradine was murdered?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately, as though carefully weighing the implications of her answer. When she did speak, it was with the weight of someone who had seen enough to know when silence was as telling as words. "I believe," she said slowly, "he came seeking the truth, and I believe someone was so afraid of that truth, they felt the need to stop him." A deep silence fell between them, broken only by the faint clink of the teacup, as Reverend Phelps refilled her cup, his hands trembling ever so slightly. Miss Marple's mind, meanwhile, continued to race, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that felt dangerously close to completion. The photograph, the hidden compartment in Carradine's coat, the strange ash-stained envelope, and even the fragmented accounts of those who had seen him last. All these elements seemed to weave together, but there was something far too neat about the way they fit. A returning traitor, an artist with secrets, a frightened servant, a wartime love affair. The story was tight, almost too tight, and Miss Marple knew that when a tale appeared too symmetrical, it was often because something vital was being hidden in plain sight. She opened her notebook once more, her fingers brushing over the timeline she had carefully compiled, the sharp points of questions poking through the otherwise smooth surface. Why now? Why had Carradine returned after all these years? What had brought him to her garden, where he had stood, staring not at her house, but directly at her? And why, she mused, did so many people claim to know so much about him, but offer so little that was concrete? Her questions pressed upon her like a weight, and she closed the book with a soft snap, her expression thoughtful, almost resigned. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime in villages like St. Mary Me, where gossip was an art form, and suspicion could weave its threads through the most innocent of conversations. She had learned long ago that the loudest voices were often the most eager to misdirect, and the truth was never where people thought to look. It lay in the quieter, older places, hidden in the small gestures, the half-formed words, the stories barely whispered. With a slight frown, she turned her attention to the chest at the foot of her bed, the one she seldom opened. Within it, amongst the faded handkerchiefs, dried lavender, and brittle letters, was an album of photographs, some of the oldest memories she carried. As her fingers flipped through the pages, she came upon a photo that stopped her cold. A group shot from the summer of 1939. It had been an engagement party, Lavinia Blackthorne's engagement, though she recalled, with a pang of sadness, that it had not been her last. There, standing slightly apart from the others, was a man in a light suit, a tall slim figure, whose features were sharper than they had been in the photograph Carradine had carried. His eyes, though, were unmistakable. Daniel Carradine. She had not recognized him immediately in the photo, but now, seeing it clearly again, everything clicked into place. He had been introduced to Lavinia as a civil servant, but even then there had been rumors, whispers of other associations, secrets that did not belong to the man he pretended to be. She stared at the photograph for a long time, the connection suddenly clear in her mind. The image Carradine had carried in his coat, the one that had caused such distress when she showed it to him, was of her. But why had he been so focused on Lavinia? Could he have mistaken the two of them in his age? Or was there something deeper, something darker at play? Had he been involved with Lavinia in ways that no one, not even she, had ever known? And then a thought struck her. A chilling, unsettling thought. Perhaps the truth he had come searching for had been far closer to home than she could have imagined. The air in St. Mary Me had never felt so thick, as if the very ground beneath it trembled with the weight of old secrets, waiting for the right moment to surface. Miss Marple, a woman who had spent her entire life in the shadows of whispers, had long since learned that the loudest voices often masked the most dangerous truths. She had observed time and again that true danger rarely announced itself with the grandeur of spies and wartime conspiracies. It was far more insidious, creeping into the quiet corners of everyday life. And it was here, in the midst of what seemed like ordinary village drama, that the most profound mysteries lay. Daniel Carradine's return was no coincidence, nor was his tragic end. Every piece of the puzzle, from the hidden photograph to the burnt scraps of paper, told a story of betrayal, but not the kind people expected. The real betrayal had never worn the uniform of a soldier or the badge of a spy. It had worn the face of someone far closer, someone with ties to those who had once been above suspicion. Miss Marple's mind kept circling back to the photograph, a memory locked away in the pages of her own past. She had recalled the engagement party, the warm summer days before the war, a time when life seemed so simple. But looking at the photo now, something in it unnerved her. There in the corner of the image stood Carradine, a stranger yet familiar, his eyes betraying a depth of pain and longing that Miss Marple recognized far too well. And then the letter, the one Lavinia Blackthorne had written to Carradine. carefully hidden in a scorched envelope, with the fragile ink still legible, despite the fire's attempts to erase its contents. The words spoke of a promise, an old love, a secret meeting, a betrayal long buried. It all tied back to the same question. Why had Carradine returned after so many years? Why had he sought the truth? And who in turn was so determined to stop him? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in the grand gestures, the accusations of espionage, or the stories of wartime sacrifice. It lay in the quieter moments, in the spaces between what was said and what was left unsaid. As she sat in her parlor, her fingers tracing the edges of the charred envelope, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift. The quiet arrival of Diana Stone, the artist who had come to St. Mary Me under the guise of seeking peace and inspiration, seemed increasingly suspicious. Why was there no trace of her family, no record of her past? What did she know of Lavenia's disappearance? And what role had she played in the unraveling of the secrets that had tormented the village for so long? Miss Marple knew the truth would not be found in bold declarations or public confessions. It would come in whispers, in the places where people least expected it. The connections were there between the faded photographs, the hidden messages, the silent, sorrowful eyes of those who had been left behind. As she flipped through the dates and names in her notebook, the records of births, marriages, and obituaries, a chill settled over her. Each name, each date, felt like a thread in a larger tapestry, one that when pulled would unravel everything. The truth, buried beneath layers of history and lies, was finally coming to light. But with it came the knowledge that some secrets once revealed could never be forgotten. Miss Marple closed the notebook gently, her heart racing with the knowledge that the end of this story would be darker than she had anticipated. For now the quiet village of St. Mary Me had become the stage for a drama far more intricate and dangerous than anyone had imagined. The echoes of the past were beginning to resonate louder than ever before, and Miss Marple was determined to see it through to the end. Mary Me had always held a quiet, almost oppressive weight, an unspoken tension that seemed to ripple through the cobbled streets, whispering of long-buried truths that no one dared uncover. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime reading the spaces between people's words, had long understood the delicate balance between what was said and what was left unsaid. Yet now, in the dimly lit corners of her parlor, as she examined the faded edges of a photograph she'd once seen before, the truth was beginning to emerge, sharp and unmistakable. Diana Stone was no mere artist, no transient soul seeking inspiration. She was something far more dangerous, a legacy of scandal buried beneath layers of deception and silenced voices. The woman in the photograph, framed by a time before the war, was unmistakably Lavenia Blackthorne, but not the Lavenia the village had come to know. This was the woman whose life had been hidden away, whose betrayal had been so meticulously erased, that even Diana, raised in the shadow of her own origins, had never fully understood who she was until now. Miss Marple's mind churned as she pieced together the fragments of the puzzle. Diana's mother, Lavenia, had vanished under mysterious circumstances, her disappearance cloaked in lies and rumors. The child Lavenia had borne, a child no one had known about, had been adopted and raised far from St. Mary Me, away from the whispers of the past. But there was something in Diana, something in the way she moved, in her quiet sorrow, that drew her back to the very place where her life had begun. The connection was undeniable. Daniel Carradine's return was no coincidence. The man who had once been Lavenia's intended had spent decades in exile, marked by the heavy burden of suspicion and silence. But now, his return to the village was driven by a singular purpose: to uncover the truth of Lavenia, and the child she had borne. The photograph he had left behind, the one Miss Marple had been staring at, wasn't just a memento of a long-lost connection. It was a breadcrumb, a clue meant to lead him to the heart of a mystery that had been buried for far too long. But as Daniel walked the village, studying its records, its faces, and its memories. He unwittingly awakened a threat, one that would stop at nothing to ensure the past remained locked away. Miss Marple had seen it all before, the hidden glances, the subtle discomforts, the Major's unease when Lavenia's name was mentioned, Diana's trembling hand as she gazed at that photograph of a girl in uniform. It all pointed to something far more sinister. Someone, perhaps more than one, had known that Carradine's return posed a threat not to their safety, but to their carefully constructed lives. They had ensured that his search for answers would not lead to revelations, but to ruin. And then there was the letter, half-burnt, carefully destroyed. A fragile remnant of a truth too dangerous to keep. The person who had burned it had known that once the past was uncovered, the carefully protected lies, the reputations built on lies, would crumble. The very existence of Diana, once thought lost to time, could unravel everything. Miss Marple stood at the edge of her garden, her eyes tracing the path where a stranger had once stood, unaware that his presence would set in motion the unraveling of a life, a history, a carefully hidden legacy. "He came," she murmured softly, her voice tinged with both sorrow and understanding, "to unearth the truth." But it wasn't hatred that had killed Daniel Carradine. It was fear, the fear of revelation, of the truth finally breaking free from the tight grip of silence. The truth, Miss Marple knew, always found its way to the surface. It never stayed buried for long, whether through half-burnt letters, forgotten photographs, or the quiet, persistent gaze of a stranger in the garden. The past would always come for those who tried to keep it dead, and when it did, it would be merciless. The drawing room at Hawthorne Reach was thick with unspoken truths, its silence disturbed only by the faint clink of porcelain, and the occasional crackle of the fire that seemed to echo too loud for such a small room. Yet no one dared speak. Outside, dusk was crawling its way across the hills, and inside the assembled faces wore masks of composure stretched too thin over nerves that had begun to fray. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Whitlow, not a detective by profession, but a woman who had seen the cost of silence in 1,000 quiet tragedies. And tonight, her voice would be the blade that split the veil. "We speak this evening not of gossip or grievance," she began, her tone even, almost disarmingly calm, "but of something far more corrosive. What people hide when the truth threatens to unravel the lives they've so carefully constructed." Across from her sat Colonel Bertram Gray, a man whose war medals gleamed with pride, but whose eyes flickered at the mention of the past. Beside him, Lydia Moorcroft, hands folded too tightly, knuckles white. At the far end, near the curtained window, sat Helena Dorsey, young, beautiful, and until last week believed to be an orphan. The fire cracked again. Eleanor's gaze fell on the envelope in her lap, its edges singed and contents half erased. But enough remained to reveal a date, a name and a promise. June 3rd, 1945. "Meet me in the orchard. I will explain everything." That letter had never reached its intended reader. Eleanor laid it down on the table, letting its presence speak the unspeakable. Helena, eyes wide, looked from face to face as the truth edged closer like fog rolling in over moorland. The man who had returned to Hawthorne Reach last month, Jonathan Arkwright, the recluse once branded a deserter, had not come to settle scores but to find the daughter he never knew had lived. During the final months of the war, he had loved Margaret Gray, Colonel Gray's niece, and she had conceived a child. The scandal had been smothered by the family with the kind of efficient cruelty only the truly respectable can wield. Margaret was sent away under the guise of illness, her child placed with a distant cousin and renamed. The orchard meeting never happened. Arkwright was shipped to the front under false pretenses, and Margaret died shortly after childbirth, her letters intercepted, and her memory gradually erased, except from the heart of the man who had never stopped looking. He had come back, drawn by a familiar painting displayed in a local exhibition, Helena's self-portrait, unknowingly echoing the features of a woman long dead. He had asked questions, read parish records, walked the same cobbled lanes until his presence became too unsettling. Then, just as suddenly, he was found dead, collapsed in the churchyard. The cause labeled as heart failure, though the coroner's report carried discrepancies too quiet to shout. Eleanor rose slowly, her hand resting on the arm of the chair. Jonathan Arkwright died not because his heart failed, she said, but because someone ensured the truth would never reach the light of day. Whether it was poison or panic, we may never know. But we do know he was silenced. A breath caught across the room. Lydia Moorcroft let out a soft sob. Colonel Grey stiffened. And Helena's tears came not in shock, but in something deeper, recognition. You knew, she whispered, her voice breaking. You all knew. Eleanor nodded slowly. And now, my dear, so do you. The fire flared. A gust of wind pressed against the windows. And somewhere beyond the hills, the first stars appeared, bearing witness to a secret no longer buried, but finally spoken aloud. Poison is never just a weapon. It is a decision, a message, a line crossed so silently, that by the time the world realizes, it's already too late. Miss Elena Harrow knew this truth, not from books, but from years of quietly watching people deceive each other with smiles and secrets. That evening, as the amber light of dusk painted the drawing room in long haunting shadows, she stood like a sentinel of truth amidst people bound by blood, silence and fear. Outside, the wind rustled the ivy against the stone walls, but inside, all was unnaturally still, as if the house itself held its breath, bracing for what it knew was coming. Seated before her were Colonel Harbridge, whose polished boots and military rigidity could no longer mask the guilt swimming behind his eyes. Young Clara Wynne, so full of questions, and unaware that the answers would tear through everything she believed about herself. And Inspector Darnell, his silence more threatening than any words, his presence deliberate and final. Elena's voice, when it came, was calm, too calm. And with every syllable, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. This house has held a lie for far too long, she said, her eyes never leaving the Colonel's face. And tonight, that lie ends. The Colonel flinched just slightly, but it was enough. She stepped closer, her tone tightening. Anthony Greaves didn't return for sentiment, Colonel. He came with purpose. He came because he had finally found proof of Clara's parentage, of his connection to Amelia, of the night that shattered 3 lives and birthed a lie that grew into a legacy. Clara gasped, her face pale, a lifetime of half-memories suddenly flooding with meaning. And still the Colonel said nothing, gripping the arms of his chair like a man drowning quietly in his own shame. You feared exposure, Elena continued, not for what you did during the war, but for what you did after, for the forged records, the forced silence, the carefully orchestrated inheritance. Her words fell like hammer blows. You met Anthony by the greenhouse, not in anger, but with pretense. You poured him brandy, a symbol of reconciliation, but only one glass held the poison. She paused, letting the accusation breathe in the stunned silence. From your garden, the devil's bane aconite thrives beneath your care, odorless, tasteless, deadly. You stood there watching as he sipped, his trust unbroken, his heart open, and you said nothing. The Colonel's jaw trembled, his eyes now locked in a faraway place. He could no longer escape. You believed the village would forget him, as they always had, but they didn't forget the boots, she added softly, almost like an afterthought, though it was anything but. The soil on Anthony's boots was thick, wet clay, the kind only found near your greenhouse after watering. Not church soil, not roadside dust, no, this was garden soil, fresh and heavy, clinging to him like the truth you tried so hard to bury. Inspector Darnell scribbled something quietly, but said nothing, his silence now heavy with confirmation. Elena stepped back slightly, her final words slow and deliberate. You walked away from that meeting untouched, unseen, unrepentant. But ghosts don't stay buried, Colonel, especially not the ones we create with our own hands. Anthony came seeking closure, not vengeance, and in return, you gave him silence. You sealed his fate with a glass raised in false peace. But tonight, that silence ends. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Each tick, now a drumbeat in the colonel's chest. Outside, the sky had turned a deeper shade of grey, and the air pressed against the windows like a storm waiting for permission to break. Inside, no one moved. The truth had been spoken, not with rage, but with the quiet precision of a blade sliding between ribs, and all that remained was the reckoning it demanded. Poison, in this case, was never just a weapon. It was the final breath of a secret too shameful to speak, the last whisper of a guilt that had festered beneath the surface, like rot beneath floorboards. It wasn't poured with hatred, but with desperation, a cruel mercy disguised as silence. Lady Evelyn Harcroft stood in the center of the grand yet suffocating drawing-room, draped in mourning black and layered in lace. But it was not her attire that weighed her down. It was the burden of knowledge she could no longer ignore. The air around her was thick, not just with the scent of polished wood and dying fire, but with the heavy presence of old lies that clung to the walls like ivy, growing wild in the dark. Eyes watched her, some wide with fear, others narrowed with suspicion, as she took a slow step forward, her voice steady yet laced with quiet fury. "This wasn't just a death," she said, her fingers trembling only slightly as she raised a fragile envelope, the paper so thin it nearly crumbled beneath her grip. This was a message, a warning, a final act of deflection. She placed it on the table with a softness that felt louder than any shout. "This letter," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room, "was meant to point the blame away, to throw suspicion into chaos. But there's one flaw, one detail that reveals its origin." The ink was still wet, written in panic, not premeditation. Her eyes locked onto Colonel Asquith. The room seemed to still, even the fire giving a quiet pop like the manor itself was listening. "Your handwriting betrayed you. The same intricate curls in the letter F. The same hesitating flick in your capital B. It matches your journal precisely. You wrote this note, Colonel. You who fought wars and wore medals, now caught by ink and arrogance." Asquith sat motionless, the disciplined rigidity of a soldier hiding the storm unraveling within. Evelyn took another step, her voice now softer, more surgical. "But the letter was only part of your design. You staged the scene. You placed the tonic bottle, its contents poisoned with monkshood, next to the decanter, ensuring it would seem an unfortunate mix-up. You created a story where guilt danced just out of reach, where questions led to dead ends. But the truth, Colonel, the truth never stays buried, especially not when blood binds it." She turned to Polly, the young maid shrinking near the curtains, her wide eyes glistening with confusion and dread. "You said you never knew your parents," Evelyn said gently, "but someone did, someone who kept you close, while pretending to keep his distance." She turned again to Asquith, whose eyes had fallen to the floor, his facade beginning to crack. "You placed her in this house. You ensured her employment. You saw her grow, always from the corner of your eye, because she was the one piece of your past you couldn't abandon. Your daughter, born of a love you denied, raised in a lie you constructed, and ultimately punished for a truth you feared would destroy you." Asquith inhaled, sharply, like a man surfacing from drowning, but said nothing. Polly stared at him, her hands shaking as though the world beneath her had shifted, and she could no longer find her footing. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Evelyn stepped back slightly, her tone now woven with sorrow. "You thought silence was safety. That distance was protection. But secrets have weight, Colonel, and in carrying them, you crushed everything you meant to preserve." The inspector moved forward as Asquith finally looked up, his face hollow, stripped of authority, of pride, of defense. "I tried to spare her," he whispered, the words dry, broken. "But in hiding her, I erased her." His voice cracked, and he closed his eyes as the cold touch of iron cuffs met his wrists. No resistance followed, no protests, no pleas, just a man sinking beneath the gravity of his own lies. Outside the manor, The sky had dimmed, the storm clouds rolling in as if nature itself mourned the unraveling. Villagers gathered, murmuring in confusion, unaware that inside those ornate walls, a man had fallen not to violence, but to truth. Evelyn watched from the window, her reflection faint in the glass beside the trembling image of Polly. She didn't feel triumph, only a familiar ache, for she knew too well that the dead don't haunt us, their truths do. And in the end, it is not bullets or betrayal that break the strongest of men, but the secrets they refuse to speak. In the quiet aftermath of scandal, the village of Weather Hollow resumed its rhythm, though nothing quite beat in time as it once had. The chiming of church bells felt hollow, as though mourning not a person but a truth too long denied. Arabella Vexley, once a name whispered with awe, now kept to the ivy-draped cottage by the chapel, where her garden bloomed not with color, but with memories buried beneath each root and stone. They said she refused the invitations, curators from Cambridge, letters from Paris, patrons who offered praise with one hand and possession with the other, and instead painted only in silence. Her work transformed. The faces once turned away, now faced the viewer unflinching, their eyes sharp with recognition, their hands cradling artifacts of the past, an heirloom locket, a blood-stained lace glove, a single button torn in struggle. One rain-slick afternoon, she brought to Eleanor Hemsley, who had once uncovered the truth with nothing but an instinct for silence, a portrait of a boy beneath an ash tree, painted from a blurred photograph, left anonymously on her doorstep. "I think," Arabella whispered, as though admitting it aloud made it real. "He knew he wouldn't return, so he waited here, in memory, not in time." Eleanor did not speak, nor need to. Arabella's inheritance, after all, was not coins or deeds, but revelation, the kind that lingers beneath the skin like a scar, unseen but unforgettable. And in the weeks that followed, as the spring crept gently back into the hedgerows and the roses dared again to bloom, the village returned to its patterns. Curious eyes peered from curtains. Children dared one another to linger by the haunted hedge, but something subtle had shifted. The vicarage held its tea circles and whispered prayers, but those prayers carried the weight of new knowledge of the missing ledger hidden in the church wall, the coded hymn that exposed the vicar's brother as the long-vanished Lieutenant Marlowe, and the blackmail that had started not with greed, but guilt. Eleanor and Reverend Elric sat often in the vicarage garden then, not to recount the crime but to trace its echoes, the way grief folds itself into habit, how the silence of women is inherited like linen, washed and passed on. "We speak of sin like it vanishes," the Reverend said one dusky evening, "but really it roots itself, quiet and deep." Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on the edge of the hedge where the ground never quite softened. "It doesn't leave," she said. "It waits." And though laughter eventually returned to the cobbled lanes, and gossip dulled into legend, Eleanor knew, as did Arabella, that beneath the lavender and rosemary, beneath every polite smile and polished pew, Weather Hollow would never forget. Because evil, when it comes, often comes dressed not in shadows, but in familiarity, and what haunted them most wasn't what had happened, but how easily it could happen again. She wore the calm of long-forgotten sorrow, like a shawl draped gently over her shoulders, and though her hands moved with the grace of repetition, there was something heavy in each gesture, as if the very air around her remembered more than she dared speak. The village of Elmridge, seemingly nestled in peace, had its stillness disturbed not by thunder or sirens, but by the soundless return of a stranger, Dominic Vale, whose presence unsettled more than the birds in the trees. They said he came to settle a will, to sort through the dusty remains of an aunt's estate, but those who watched him from behind floral curtains knew, this man wasn't just looking for heirlooms, he was digging for ghosts. With a gaze too steady and questions too precise, he moved through the village like a scalpel through scar tissue, peeling back layers no one had dared touch for decades. And beneath those layers lay Isobel Harrow, a woman once known for her grace, her garden, and her absence of scandal, until now. During the war she'd loved someone she wasn't meant to love, carried a child she wasn't allowed to keep, and buried that part of her soul beneath decades of silence and flowers that never bloomed quite right in the spring. Miss Helena Brent, now old and trembling, had helped hide that shame once, holding the child, lying to the nurses, and keeping the ledger unmarked, acts she now saw not as protection, but as complicity. The truth emerged not in screams or confessions, but slowly, through torn letters found behind wainscoting, a lock of hair sealed in an envelope, and a church record edited in faded ink. Dominic didn't arrive seeking vengeance, but in searching for his roots, he unearthed the village's greatest fear, not that they had sinned, but that their sins had grown into silence. Isobel, tired of holding her breath through every decade, finally spoke, not in desperation, but in quiet exhaustion, recounting the story she'd memorized in her bones. No one interrupted her, not even Miss Alcott, the village historian, who had become the unlikely keeper of Elmridge's conscience. In the drawing room, over tea turned cold, truth poured heavier than the rain outside. Dominic listened, eyes unreadable, then placed a single rose on Isobel's garden gate, and left without a word, leaving behind not anger, but a quiet mercy. That spring, the garden bloomed too early, and too wild, as if stirred by secrets finally freed from the soil. And the villagers, once fearful of scandal, learned that it isn't always the wicked who carry the darkest truths, it is often those who loved quietly, suffered silently, and chose peace over confrontation. Miss Brent was later heard whispering, as she trimmed her roses, "The past doesn't rot when buried, it roots." So I ask you, had you been in Isobel's shoes, would you have told the truth after all those years? Did Dominic's silence speak louder than any accusation? And what do you think of those who protected her all these years? Were they loyal, or merely cowards in kindness? Drop your thoughts below. Your theories keep this story breathing. And if you love mysteries woven with emotion, buried secrets, and the quiet unraveling of what once was, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting tales that stir the soul. Share this with those who believe some gardens aren't meant to be trimmed, because every vine, every bloom, carries the weight of something once unspoken. Until next time, remember, truth doesn't always knock, sometimes it slips in through the cracks.